The restaurant buzzed with the typical hum of clinking cutlery and lively chatter as the evening rush filled every seat. Located in the heart of a quaint but politically divided town, this eatery wasn't just a spot for good food, it was a microcosm of the community. On this particular evening, however, that comfortable balance of familiarity was about to be shattered. Barron Trump walked in alone, his presence initially unnoticed by most patrons. He wasn't the type to flaunt his name or heritage, he preferred blending into the crowd when he could. But tonight, he wore a bright red MAGA hat perched confidently on his head, the emblem immediately catching the eye of several customers. Whispered conversations erupted across tables. Some gazes lingered with curiosity, others with disapproval. For a town already divided on countless issues, this hat symbolized more than just a political stance, it was a flashpoint. The restaurant manager, a wiry man in his 50s named Mark, had been overseeing the dinner rush from behind the counter. Mark was known for his strong personality and his outspoken views, often sharing them with regulars over coffee. He spotted the hat almost immediately. His jaw tightened as he wiped his hands on a dish towel, weighing his options. Mark prided himself on running an inclusive establishment, but the sight of that hat stirred something deep within him. To him, it represented division, conflict, and exclusion, everything he stood against. As Barron approached the counter to place his order, the tension in the room was palpable. Mark stepped forward, his expression stern but controlled. "Excuse me, young man," he began, his voice carrying just enough volume to capture the attention of nearby tables. "We have a policy here against political displays of any kind. I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat or leave." Barron, taken aback but composed, looked Mark in the eye. He had been in situations like this before. Growing up in a high-profile family meant every action, no matter how small, was scrutinized. Still, he hadn't expected this reaction tonight. "I'm just here for a meal," he replied evenly. "I'm not here to make a statement or cause trouble." The restaurant grew quieter as more patrons tuned into the unfolding scene. Some pulled out their phones, recording discreetly from their tables. Mark's expression hardened. "You understand that, but this hat sends a message. And frankly, it's not welcome here." Barron hesitated, glancing around the room. He noticed the divided reactions, a table of older gentlemen nodding in approval of Mark's stance, while a younger couple whispered in dismay. A mother at a nearby table covered her child's ears, clearly trying to shield them from the tension. "I think you're misunderstanding my intentions," Barron said, his voice steady. "I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable. This is just a hat." Mark shook his head, his frustration mounting. "It's not just a hat to the people in this room. And as the owner of this establishment, I have the right to enforce policies that maintain a comfortable environment for my customers. So, it's your choice, remove it or leave." The confrontation reached a boiling point. Barron stood his ground, his expression a mix of frustration and calm defiance. "I'll leave," he said finally, his voice firm but not loud. He turned on his heel and began walking toward the door, his exit punctuated by the soft murmurs of diners and the faint ding of the restaurant's bell as the door swung shut behind him. Outside, the cool night air greeted him as he paused on the sidewalk. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Behind him, the restaurant buzzed back to life, but the ripple effects of the incident were just beginning. Within minutes, social media lit up with posts from diners who had witnessed the exchange. Videos of the confrontation quickly gained traction online, with opinions flooding in from all corners. Some praised Mark's actions, hailing him as a hero standing up against divisiveness. Others condemned the move, accusing him of intolerance and discrimination. The debate raged on, polarizing the town and drawing national attention. Barron, meanwhile, sat on a nearby bench, scrolling through the growing torrent of reactions on his phone. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way people might have expected. Instead, he felt a deep sadness for how quickly a simple meal had spiraled into a spectacle. He knew he had a choice to make. He could let the incident fester into another chapter of the ongoing culture wars, or he could find a way to turn the moment into something meaningful. As he sat there, a plan began to form in his mind, one that would take courage and creativity. To execute, the restaurant sat at the center of town, its unassuming brick exterior a quiet witness to decades of local history. Mark's Place, as it was known, had long been a favorite gathering spot for locals. Families came for breakfast on lazy Sundays, couples on first dates shared plates of pasta, and friends toasted life's milestones with glasses of red wine. To the casual observer, it was just a restaurant. But to the people who lived in the town, it was much more, a reflection of the community itself. Mark Anderson, the owner, had inherited the restaurant from his father years ago. For him, it was more than just a business. It was a stage where he could connect with people, share his values, and create an environment he believed fostered unity. That was why the sight of Barron Trump's red MAGA hat struck such a nerve. To Mark, it symbolized division, a rift in a country he loved. He wasn't blind to the irony of his reaction. By asking Barron to leave, he was, in a way, contributing to the very division he so despised. But at that moment, he had felt no other choice. What Mark didn't know was how that single decision would set off a chain reaction, one that would ripple through his restaurant, the town, and even beyond. It started with the whispers. As soon as Barron left, the dining room buzzed with speculation. "Did you see that?" one man asked his wife as she nervously sipped her coffee. "That kid looked familiar. Wasn't he?" Others began to realize who Barron was, piecing together his identity from the familiar face they had seen in headlines and social media posts. The whispers grew louder, fueled by smartphones capturing the moment and uploading it to the internet. By the time Mark returned to his office after closing that night, his inbox was flooded with messages. Some were from locals, applauding his courage. "You did the right thing," one email read. "We don't need that kind of symbolism in our town." But others weren't so kind. "Who are you to tell someone what they can and can't wear?" one message demanded. "You're just another hypocrite claiming to fight for tolerance while silencing people you disagree with." Mark was no stranger to criticism. Running a public-facing business came with its challenges. But this was different. The weight of the decision settled heavily on him. He had acted on instinct, his emotions guiding him in a moment that demanded more thought. And now, the consequences were unfolding faster than he could process. Meanwhile, Barron had returned to his hotel room. He wasn't one to wallow in self-pity, but he couldn't deny the sting of the incident. Growing up in the public eye had taught him resilience, yet moments like these still felt personal. He scrolled through social media, watching as the video of his confrontation with Mark spread like wildfire. The comments were a mix of support and criticism, with some calling him brave for standing his ground and others accusing him of intentionally provoking the situation. One comment, however, caught his attention. It was from a local high school teacher who had been dining at the restaurant that evening. "This isn't about a hat," the comment read. "It's about our inability to see past our differences and treat each other with basic human decency. What happened tonight says more about us as a society than it does about one person or one restaurant." That comment stayed with Barron. He wasn't looking for sympathy or validation, but the teacher's words struck a chord. Maybe this wasn't just about a hat. Maybe it was an opportunity, one to address something bigger. Barron decided he wouldn't let the moment define him in the way others were trying to. He would take control of the narrative and, in doing so, hopefully inspire others to think differently. The next morning, Barron began to formulate a plan. He reached out to a local charity he had read about, a small organization dedicated to bridging community divides through dialogue and education. They hosted events where people from different political, social, and cultural backgrounds could come together and share their stories. Barron explained his situation and asked if he could sponsor an event under their banner. The charity's director was hesitant at first, wary of the attention Barron's name might bring. But after a long conversation, she agreed, impressed by his sincerity and willingness to take responsibility for the controversy. Barron didn't stop there. He decided to personally invite Mark to the event. It wasn't an easy decision. Mark's words still echoed in his mind, and part of him feared rejection. But he knew that if the event was going to mean anything, it had to include the man who had started it all. Mark was taken aback when he received the invitation. He had spent the day grappling with the fallout from the incident. The restaurant had seen a spike in reservations, but not all the attention was positive. Protesters had gathered outside, holding signs both in support of and against his actions. The sight of Barron's name on the invitation felt surreal. Mark read the letter several times, trying to decipher the young man's intentions. Ultimately, curiosity won out. He decided to attend, if only to understand why Barron was reaching out. The event was scheduled for the following Friday, giving the town just enough time to become even more polarized. By the time the day arrived, the air was electric with anticipation. The venue, a modest community center, was packed with people from all walks of life. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a desire to support their side of the debate. When Barron took the stage to speak, the room fell silent. He began not with an accusation or a defense but with a story, one about his childhood, the lessons his parents had taught him about resilience and empathy, and the challenges of growing up in a world that often judged him before knowing him. He spoke candidly about the incident at the restaurant, admitting that he could have handled it differently but expressing his hope that it could lead to something positive. Mark listened intently, his arms crossed. He wasn't sure what to make of Barron's words. But when Barron turned to him and thanked him for being part of the dialogue, something shifted. Mark realized that his own actions, as impulsive as they had been, had sparked a conversation that the town desperately needed. The event concluded with small group discussions, where attendees shared their own experiences and perspectives. By the end of the night, something remarkable had happened. People who had entered the room as adversaries were leaving as allies, united by a shared desire to move past the divisions that had defined them for so long. For Barron, the event wasn't about redemption or proving a point. It was about taking a stand for what he believed in, a belief in the power of dialogue and understanding. And for Mark, it was a humbling reminder that even the best intentions could be misinterpreted, but there was always an opportunity to make things right. As the crowd dispersed, Mark approached Barron. The two shook hands, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything they had been through. "I'm sorry," Mark said quietly. "I acted out of anger. I should have listened first." Barron nodded. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." The night marked the beginning of a new chapter for the town. Conversations that had felt impossible were now happening in homes, schools, and workplaces. The restaurant, once a symbol of division, became a meeting place for community events and discussions, its walls echoing with laughter, debate, and understanding. Barron left town shortly after, but his impact remained, a testament to the power of one moment to change everything. You said. Continue part 3 more unique and lengthy and complete this part in one message without any sub-heading of 2,000 words. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. In the weeks that followed the incident at Mark's place, the town was buzzing with conversation. The confrontation between Barron Trump and the restaurant's manager had sparked something far more profound than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just about the MAGA hat or the political divide, it was about a community grappling with its values and identity. And as the tension simmered, the story of that night continued to spread far beyond the town's borders, reaching local news outlets and social media platforms, fueling debates across the nation. Locals who had witnessed the altercation couldn't stop talking about it. Every cafe, every diner, and every gathering spot was alive with opinions. "Can you believe what happened at Mark's?" became the most frequent conversation starter. Some supported Mark's decision, asserting that the hat represented more than just a piece of clothing, it was a symbol of divisiveness and intolerance. Others sided with Barron, feeling that his right to wear the hat, or any symbol, should have been respected. But what began as a simple dispute in a local restaurant quickly escalated into a broader national issue about free speech, tolerance, and the power of symbols in public spaces. The fallout from the incident reached a fever pitch when a well-known national news anchor covered the story. What had started as a local confrontation was now framed as a clash between personal freedoms and societal responsibility. The anchor, known for her sharp commentary, raised the question, what happens when a symbol meant to unite divides a community instead? And how far can we go in protecting our right to express ourselves, even if that expression is offensive to others? The question struck a chord, spreading the story far and wide. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their views on whether Mark's actions were justified or whether Barron had been unfairly singled out. The heated national debate also found its way into the town's schools. Teachers, especially at the high school, found themselves fielding questions from students eager to understand what had happened. For some, the incident was a perfect example of how divided the country had become. For others, it was a lesson in the importance of tolerance and finding ways to coexist despite differences. In the weeks that followed, many of the town's younger generation began organizing small gatherings and discussions aimed at bridging the ideological gaps. These student-led forums became a space for people to express their views and listen to others. Though tensions still ran high, there was a sense that the conversation was evolving, that people were at least trying to understand each other. The effects of the incident were also felt in the political sphere. The town's local officials, who had largely stayed out of the debate, began receiving pressure from both sides. Some constituents urged them to take a stand in support of free speech, while others demanded that they publicly condemn Barron's visit to the restaurant. As politicians began weighing in, their statements only fueled the fire. Public support for Mark grew among conservative voters, while liberals rallied behind Barron, seeing the entire situation as emblematic of the broader struggles for civil rights and freedoms. The town, once peaceful and undisturbed, had now become a battleground for political ideologies. For Barron, the days following the incident were a whirlwind. He had expected some backlash, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly things would spiral. His family, watching from afar, was concerned. His father's name had often been a lightning rod for controversy, but this situation was different. Barron wasn't a politician or a public figure in the traditional sense, he was just a young man trying to navigate a world that often felt hostile and confusing. He spent his time in solitude, pondering the events that had unfolded. He knew that something had to change, but he wasn't sure how. One evening, while scrolling through his social media feed, Barron saw a post that gave him an idea. It was a tweet from a journalist who had covered the incident, suggesting that Barron could turn the whole situation into something positive by publicly addressing the issue of division in the country. The tweet suggested that Barron use his platform to advocate for unity, especially among young people who felt caught in the crossfire of ideological battles. The idea resonated with Barron. He wasn't interested in being a figurehead for any political movement, but he did believe in the power of dialogue to heal wounds. Barron decided to reach out to the local charity that had hosted the community event and ask them if they would be willing to organize a follow-up initiative. His idea was simple: create a series of workshops focused on bridging divides and fostering understanding between people with different political views. He was clear that this wasn't about promoting one side over the other, it was about creating space for people to talk openly without judgment. The charity, intrigued by the idea, agreed to help. Within days, Barron was back in the town, this time with a mission. He partnered with the charity and local leaders to organize a public forum where people could engage in honest, open conversations. The event was scheduled for the following month, giving the town ample time to prepare. Word spread quickly, and the anticipation grew as the date approached. This time, however, the mood was different. There was no public outrage, no calls for protests. Instead, people were curious to hear what Barron had to say, and whether the event could actually lead to meaningful change. When the day of the event arrived, the community center was packed. Barron, now speaking not as the son of a former president but as a young man who had learned something profound from his experience, took the stage. The room fell silent as he began to speak. He didn't address the MAGA hat incident directly. Instead, he spoke about his own personal journey, how he had been raised in a family where politics were never simple, where every decision seemed to carry weight beyond the immediate. He talked about how the country was more divided than ever and how people were losing the ability to listen to one another. He confessed that, at the restaurant, he had acted impulsively. But he also expressed his belief that if they were ever going to move forward as a country, they had to learn to see past the symbols and the labels that divided them. What happened that night at Mark's place isn't the issue, Barron said. The real issue is what happens next. We have a chance to come together as a community, to recognize that we may disagree, but that doesn't mean we can't talk. We need to start listening to each other. We need to start seeing each other as people first, and everything else second. The crowd listened, captivated. Many had expected Barron to deliver a scripted message, to speak in the language of politics, to give a rallying cry for one side of the argument. But what they heard instead was a young man acknowledging the complexities of the situation and asking for something they had all been missing: understanding. After Barron finished speaking, the event transitioned into small group discussions, where people were encouraged to share their thoughts and listen to those with differing opinions. The atmosphere was respectful, even if the conversations were challenging. People were willing to engage, perhaps for the first time in a long while, without feeling the need to win the debate. As the night wore on, Barron moved from group to group, participating in discussions and asking questions, genuinely interested in hearing other people's perspectives. He wasn't there to dominate the conversation, he was there to learn. By the end of the evening, something had changed. The town had found a sense of common ground, or at least the beginning of one. The event wasn't a miracle, and it didn't erase the divisions that existed. But it created a space for people to see each other as human beings, to understand that differences didn't have to mean division. As Barron left the community center that night, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The incident that had started with anger, confusion, and frustration had led to something more meaningful, a conversation that had the potential to bring people together. The town wasn't healed, but it had taken its first step toward understanding. For Barron, it was the beginning of a new chapter, not just in his own life, but in the lives of everyone who had come together to listen. And he knew that it was only the beginning. In the weeks following the community forum, the town began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. The event, once seen as a potential flashpoint for further division, had opened up a floodgate of possibilities. People who had once steered clear of difficult conversations were now engaging in open, honest dialogues. The restaurant, once the epicenter of the controversy, was now a symbol of the town's commitment to healing. Mark's Place became a gathering spot not just for good food, but for community discussions, a place where people of all viewpoints could come together, break bread, and talk without judgment. But change, as it often does, came slowly. There were still pockets of resistance, people who were unwilling to let go of their anger or their entrenched beliefs. The internet, too, hadn't forgotten the incident. Barron's name continued to surface in comment threads, sometimes as a punchline, other times as a rallying cry for those who supported him. On one hand, the national media's coverage had brought more attention to the town than ever before. On the other hand, it had opened old wounds for many people who felt that their views had been marginalized. One morning, as Mark was preparing the restaurant for the day's opening, he received an unexpected call. It was from a reporter at a national news outlet, one that had covered the incident early on. The reporter wanted to know how the town was faring in the aftermath of the event and whether there had been any lasting changes. Mark, who had spent the last few weeks reflecting on the decisions he had made, was more than ready for the conversation. He shared his thoughts honestly, admitting that he had learned more than he had ever expected from the whole ordeal. He spoke about the ongoing efforts in the town to continue the dialogue that Barron had started, about the challenges they faced, and about the unexpected ways in which the community had come together. The reporter asked a simple, but loaded question: "Do you think this town will ever be the same?" Mark paused for a moment, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He thought about the faces he had seen in the community center, the strangers who had sat down together to talk about their differences. He thought about the way people had started to view each other not as enemies, but as neighbors with differing views. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but there was something unmistakable about the shift that had occurred. Mark's response was simple: "I think we're getting there. But I don't think we'll ever be the same. We've grown, and that's something." Meanwhile, Barron's life had taken a new direction as well. Though he had briefly returned to his family after the event, the experience had ignited something in him that he couldn't ignore. The national debate about his actions had prompted him to rethink his place in the world, and he found himself increasingly drawn to public service in a way he hadn't anticipated. Barron began to devote more of his time to initiatives aimed at fostering unity among young people, creating spaces where conversations about divisiveness could happen in a safe and respectful environment. What had begun as an impulsive attempt to regain control over a situation that had spiraled out of his hands had now evolved into a genuine passion for bridging divides. It wasn't just the event at Mark's place that had sparked this new path for Barron. It was the countless conversations he had had since, the way people from all walks of life had come forward to express their hopes for the future. He realized that his own story, his own experience growing up in the public eye, could serve as a vehicle for change. Barron began to travel more, speaking at youth conferences and charity events, encouraging the younger generation to engage with their peers, especially those with differing viewpoints, in an effort to break down the walls of polarization that had come to define so much of American life. His message wasn't political, but rather one of empathy, understanding, and the importance of listening before reacting. While Barron's new initiatives were growing in influence, the town continued to evolve as well. The events of that fateful night had forever altered the course of its history, but there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. People were more willing to have tough conversations, even when they disagreed. Conversations that would have once ended in shouting matches now became opportunities for learning and compromise. Mark's place, still the heart of the town, had become a symbol of that change. Every week, local community leaders gathered there to discuss ways they could continue to foster an environment of inclusion and respect. They hosted panels on political discourse, organized volunteer events for local charities, and worked together to ensure that the progress they had made didn't slip away. But despite the apparent success, there were still challenges. For some, the wounds of the past were too deep to heal, and they continued to carry the weight of their resentment. The town was not immune to the broader cultural and political shifts that were taking place across the nation, and the differences between people were not so easily erased. The underlying tensions, while less overt, still simmered beneath the surface. On the other hand, he realized that healing, especially on such a deep level, wasn't something that could be rushed. Change took time, and it required more than just words. It required sustained effort, understanding, and an unwavering commitment to seeing others as equals. Barron didn't know what the future would hold for the town or for the country. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be setbacks and challenges. But he also knew that the work had just begun. The event at Mark's place, and the aftermath, had opened his eyes to a deeper truth. True unity wasn't about agreeing on everything. It was about finding common ground in the spaces where disagreement existed. And he was more determined than ever to continue working toward that goal. The journey was far from over, but Barron felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned that the only way to heal a divided community was to meet people where they were, no matter how difficult that might be, and to start the conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. And with that, he knew he was on the right path. As the months passed, the reverberations of the event at Mark's Place continued to echo throughout the town and even beyond its borders. What had initially been a flashpoint of controversy had evolved into an ongoing conversation that, while still uncomfortable for many, was beginning to reshape the community. Barron, now back in the public eye, continued to push for change, but the road was far from easy. Though the workshops, forums, and public discussions had sparked moments of progress, there were still moments when the old divisions resurfaced, times when people, unable to let go of their anger, demanded something more definitive than words and meetings. It was early fall when Barron received an invitation to speak at a national conference on civic engagement. The event, held in a large metropolitan city, would bring together activists, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country, all working to bridge the deepening divides in America. It was an honor that Barron hadn't expected, but one that he felt he was ready for. In the months since the incident, he had refined his message, focusing not on the specifics of that one night, but on the broader theme of finding common ground in an increasingly polarized world. He knew that the work he had started in his small town had the potential to serve as a model for others, but he also understood that such a narrative came with its own set of challenges. Barron wasn't naive. He knew that true change would take more than just a speech, it would take action, persistence, and, above all, a willingness to listen. When Barron arrived at the conference, he was taken aback by the sheer scale of the event. It wasn't just a small gathering, it was a monumental assembly of people, all seeking answers to the same questions Barron had been grappling with for months. The hall was filled with panels, breakout sessions, and workshops designed to address the myriad ways in which divisions could be healed. Barron, though nervous, felt a sense of belonging. He was one of the younger speakers, and there were many seasoned professionals in the audience, but there was something about the energy of the room that reassured him. Perhaps, he thought, the path he had begun walking was part of a larger movement. Perhaps the work that was unfolding in his town was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. When Barron took the stage, the audience was quiet, expectant. It was a strange feeling, knowing that people were looking to him for answers. He had spent so much time in his town, trying to learn from others, but now it was his turn to share what he had learned. He began by speaking of the incident at Mark's Place, but not in a way that focused on the controversy. Instead, he talked about the conversations that followed, the way people had come together in the aftermath to engage in difficult, often uncomfortable, but necessary dialogues. He spoke about the challenges they faced as a community, the ways in which old wounds were reopened, and the way people fought for the right to be heard. He spoke of the lessons he had learned, not just as the son of a former president, but as a young man who had been caught in the midst of something larger than himself. "The first thing I learned," Barron said, "was that you can't start a conversation by trying to win it. We have to start by listening. We have to be willing to hear each other's stories, even when they're difficult, even when we don't agree. Only then can we begin to understand one another." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Barron continued, recounting how the workshops and forums in his town had been an attempt to not just speak, but to listen, really listen, without judgment or condemnation. He described the experience of people from opposite ends of the political spectrum sitting in the same room, sharing their fears and frustrations, their hopes and desires for a better future. It wasn't easy, he admitted. But it was worth it. And that's the truth that people have to understand, that the hard work of bridging divides is never easy, but it's always worth it. The room was still, almost reverent, as Barron spoke. He knew that his words were resonating, but he also understood that, for some, the journey was just beginning. Many in the audience had already embarked on their own efforts to create change, but Barron reminded them of the importance of persistence. The work doesn't end when we leave this room. It doesn't end when the last session is over. This is a lifelong commitment, one that requires all of us to continue showing up, day after day, even when it feels like the world is moving in the wrong direction. After Barron's speech, the discussions continued into the evening. Many of the attendees, inspired by his words, sought out Barron to ask questions, share their own experiences, or simply express their gratitude for his perspective. What had begun as an uncomfortable and divisive moment in his life had now blossomed into something far larger than he could have imagined. He was no longer just a symbol of division or controversy, he was a symbol of hope, of what could be accomplished when people were willing to do the hard work of understanding one another. However, as Barron's profile continued to rise, so too did the scrutiny. His every move, his every statement, became fodder for media outlets and social media platforms. The debate over the MAGA hat incident, while not as heated as before, still lingered in the background. Some people saw Barron as a beacon of progress, while others continued to criticize him for his involvement in the controversy. Yet, Barron had come to realize something fundamental: the opinions of others, though important, were never going to define who he was or the work he was doing. He knew that his message wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about staying true to the principles of dialogue, understanding, and mutual respect. Back in his hometown, the changes were more visible. The town itself was growing in a way that was reflective of the changes happening on a broader scale. The community center, where the first forum had been held, had become a focal point for local engagement. More people were participating in public discussions, and the town was becoming known for its commitment to open dialogue. The local schools were incorporating lessons on civility, respect, and conflict resolution into their curricula, ensuring that future generations would grow up knowing how to engage in conversations that bridged divides. Mark's Place had also seen a resurgence in business, not just because of the food, but because people now saw it as a symbol of the town's resilience and commitment to healing. Yet, there was a new, more subtle challenge emerging. As the town's reputation for fostering dialogue spread, there was a growing tension between those who wanted to keep pushing for open conversations and those who felt the effort had gone far enough. Some people, weary from the ongoing debates, felt that the time had come to move on, to focus on other issues. Others felt that the conversations were still too one-sided, that the work of true unity had not yet been achieved. It was at this crossroads that Barron made the decision to return to his roots. He recognized that while national platforms and high-profile events had given him a larger audience, the work needed to continue in the town itself. He came back to Mark's Place, not as a speaker or a figurehead, but as an active participant in the ongoing work. Barron reconnected with the local leaders, helping to facilitate conversations that were more difficult and personal. The conversations, though at times painful, were necessary. They involved asking hard questions, questions about identity, privilege, and power, questions that, though uncomfortable, were essential to the community's healing. In time, Barron's efforts began to pay off. The town had become a place not just of understanding, but of action. People were taking the lessons they had learned and using them to improve the broader world. Volunteers from the town began traveling to other communities, sharing their experiences and offering their help in bridging divides in places where conversations about unity were still in their infancy. Barron, though still young, had become a mentor to many, guiding them through the complexities of reconciliation and understanding. He had gone from a boy trying to navigate the storm of public opinion to a young leader who had found his voice in the most unlikely of places. The work wasn't over. It never would be. But Barron knew that the town, and his own journey, had come full circle. From that night at Mark's Place to the national stage, he had learned that true change was not about instant results. It was about the small, consistent efforts of individuals working together, pushing through the discomfort of disagreement to find common ground. And in that, he saw the future. 1 months turned into years, and Barron continued his efforts to foster dialogue and healing. The town had become a microcosm for the broader movement he championed, a place where people from diverse backgrounds and viewpoints came together, not just to talk, but to listen and to act. Yet, despite the visible progress, Barron understood that the true challenge had only just begun. The world outside his town was still deeply divided. The national conversation remained fragmented, and every time an issue arose, people seemed to retreat further into their respective corners. It was as if the walls of division were constantly being rebuilt, brick by brick, with every new headline or social media post. Barron, though, had a renewed sense of purpose. The work that had started so painfully with the incident at Mark's place had now blossomed into something he could never have predicted. He had grown, not just as a public figure, but as a person who had learned the importance of stepping into uncomfortable spaces and confronting difficult truths. His journey had forced him to rethink everything he had once believed about division, about power, and about the true meaning of unity. He had seen firsthand how progress was made, not by avoiding conflict, but by embracing it and allowing it to transform both individuals and communities. By now, Barron had become a sought-after speaker and had begun organizing his own initiatives. He had partnered with organizations dedicated to reconciliation and had launched programs in schools and communities to teach conflict resolution, empathy, and civic responsibility. He knew that the future of the country rested in the hands of young people, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to build a better, more united world. His message was clear: it wasn't about trying to change others, it was about changing how we interact with each other. He encouraged people to step out of their comfort zones and to have the kinds of conversations that could move beyond political lines, the kind of dialogues that built bridges instead of walls. Conversation at a time. However, not everyone was on board. As Barron's profile continued to rise, so too did the criticism. The more people he reached, the more polarized the reactions became. Some accused him of being naive, others of trying to push an agenda that was too idealistic for the harsh realities of the world. Every time Barron spoke out, there were those who dismissed him as out of touch, as someone who didn't fully understand the depth of the problems the nation faced. And yet, despite the detractors, Barron persisted. He knew that the only way to truly heal the wounds of a fractured society was through conversation, through creating spaces where people could be heard, even when it was difficult. Back in the town, the changes were still evident, but the work continued. The discussions didn't stop at town meetings or community forums. They spilled over into everyday interactions. In coffee shops, on street corners, in homes, people were talking, listening, and, most importantly, learning. The ripple effect of the events at Mark's place had reached far beyond the town's borders, and it was clear that the town had become an example for others to follow. While the national stage was still filled with tension and division, there was a quiet optimism in the town. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to be faced, but there was a belief that change was possible, one conversation at a time. The town's schools had embraced Barron's message, and the next generation was being raised with a different mindset. Children learned not just math and science, but also the art of dialogue. They were taught to listen before speaking, to seek understanding before making judgments. Teachers were trained in conflict resolution, and students were encouraged to engage in discussions that involved all sides of an issue. The town had become a place where differences were not just tolerated, but respected, where unity didn't mean uniformity, but a commitment to understanding and cooperation. As the years passed, Barron's commitment to the cause never wavered. He spent more time traveling, meeting with leaders from other communities, and sharing the lessons he had learned. But the more Barron saw of the world, the more he realized how much work there was to be done. The conversation he had started was far from over. While there were successes to celebrate, there was still so much ground to cover. Across the country, the fractures were deepening, and it often felt like the gap between people who disagreed was widening instead of closing. Barron knew that the key to real progress lay in the willingness to have difficult conversations, even when they seemed pointless or impossible. He had seen firsthand how those conversations could spark change, how they could challenge assumptions and open minds. But he also knew that change took time, and that the work was never linear. Some days, the road forward seemed clear, other days, it felt like they were taking 2 steps backward for every 1 step forward. But Barron remained determined, because he knew that even small, incremental change was still change. The town continued to thrive as a symbol of what was possible when people came together with a shared commitment to healing and understanding. But the most profound transformation wasn't in the town itself, it was in Barron. The young man who had once stumbled into the public eye, who had been thrust into a national controversy that seemed to define him, had now become a leader in his own right. He had found his voice not in the loudest moments of his life, but in the quiet ones, when he sat across from someone who disagreed with him, and instead of reacting with anger, he listened, he understood, and he engaged. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But Barron had come to realize that true leadership wasn't about winning the argument or convincing others that you were right. It was about building bridges, even when it seemed like the gap was too wide to cross. It was about creating spaces where people could be vulnerable, where they could challenge each other without fear of judgment. And it was about continuing to show up, even when the world seemed determined to pull people apart. As Barron looked out over the town he had come to love, he knew that the journey wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, still walls to be torn down. But for the first time in a long while, Barron felt a sense of peace. The work he had started, the conversations he had begun, were not just a part of his past, they were his future. The lessons he had learned along the way were lessons that would continue to guide him as he moved forward. He knew that he couldn't change the world in one day, but he also knew that the work he had done had made a difference. And that, in itself, was enough to keep going. The world, Barron realized, wasn't defined by the divisions that separated people. It was defined by the conversations they had, the willingness to listen, to understand, and to move forward together. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to do just that, one conversation at a time.